The night Mara fed a stranger from her own plate, she did not know she had just chosen a king. She did not know the rain on the kitchen roof was the same rain falling on a battlefield's 3 valleys north, where a crown had been pulled from a dying man's brow and set on the head of a wolf who had not yet decided whether to wear it. She did not know that the cracked back door of the inn she scrubbed for coppers would, by autumn, be the most watched door in the kingdom of Vale. She knew only that the soup was thin tonight, that her wrist still ached from the innkeeper's grip that afternoon, and that a man too large for the doorway had stepped into her kitchen out of the dark, water sheeting from a black cloak, and asked, in a voice that was more chest than throat, whether there was anything to eat. She should have called for the innkeeper. She did not. She looked at him for a long moment, at the road dust on his boots and the cut at his temple, and the way his hand stayed near his hip in the manner of men who had learned to expect knives, and she pulled out the wooden stool by the hearth and pointed at it. He sat. He filled the stool the way a storm fills a sky. She took her own bowl from the shelf, the one with the chipped rim that the cook said was bad luck, and she set it in front of him. She tore her bread in half and put the larger half in his hand. He looked at the bread, then at her, and something behind his eyes moved like a wolf turning in its sleep. He did not thank her. He ate the way men eat after they have stopped pretending they are not starving. The kitchen smelled of onions and old smoke and wet wool. Outside, the rain hammered the shutters. Mara stood at the table with her hands folded in front of her apron and watched him eat what should have been her dinner. And she did not feel afraid. What she did not know was that the man across her table had killed 9 men by sundown, that the crown of Vale rode under his cloak in a leather satchel because there had been nowhere safe to set it down, and that the second self inside him, the one with yellow eyes and an old, patient hunger, had already lifted its head at the scent of her and decided. The wolf inside him, who had not loved anything in 12 winters, had decided. He set the empty bowl down with a care that did not match his hands. He looked up at her. He said low, as if the word cost him something, "Please." She did not understand at first. Then she did. She lifted the soup pot from the hook and ladled what was left into the bowl and pushed it back across the table. He ate that too. When he was done, he stood, and the kitchen seemed to shrink, and she had to tip her chin up to look at his face. There was a long scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his eyes were the color of river ice in winter, and he was looking at her as if he were memorizing something he did not intend to forget. He reached into a pocket inside the cloak. She braced for coin and was already shaking her head, because it was bad luck, the cook had told her, to take coin for the first meal a stranger ever ate at your fire. Instead, he set down a small carved thing on the table between them. A wolf, no bigger than her thumb, smooth from being touched, one ear chipped from age. She stared at it. He said, "For the hands that fed me." He pulled the hood of the cloak back up. He went out into the rain. The door swung shut behind him, and the latch did not catch, and the wind pushed it open again. And Mara stood there with the little wooden wolf in her palm, looking at the dark where he had gone, and the hum in her chest, the thing she would later learn to call the thread, was already singing a note she did not know the name of yet. She did not sleep that night. She told herself it was the storm. She did not put the wolf on the shelf with her other small things. She kept it in the pocket over her ribs, where she could feel it when she breathed. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the inn yard was a soup of mud, and the innkeeper, old Brunn, was already shouting for her to come scrub the front step before the morning coach. She came. She scrubbed. She did not mention the man. She did not mention the soup. She did not mention that she had given away the bread that was meant to last her 2 days. She would eat thinner. She had eaten thinner before. The morning coach brought a merchant with a complaint about his sheets, and 2 pilgrims headed for the high passes, and a thin man in gray who looked too long at the inn's signpost and rode on. Mara did not see him look. She was on her knees in the mud. She was thinking about a voice that had said, "Please," as if the word were a wound it had to push out of itself. And she was thinking about how, when the stranger had reached for the bowl, his sleeve had pulled back, and there had been a mark on the inside of his wrist that looked, in the firelight, like a moon being eaten by a wolf. She did not know it was the royal sigil of Vale. She did not know that every soldier and every assassin and every council spy between here and the capital was, at that moment, looking for the man who wore it. She knew only that he had come hungry, and she had fed him, and her chest was humming, and she could not stop touching the small carved wolf in her pocket, as if it might fly away. He came back the next night. He came back the night after that. He came back every night for 13 nights, always after the inn's common room had emptied, and old Brunn had taken his bottle and his bad temper up the stairs to bed, always through the cracked back door, always shaking rain or dew or wind off a black cloak. He never sat in the common room. He never asked for a bed. He never asked her name. The first night she had not asked his either, because she had not known how. And after that, the not asking had become its own ritual, the way the kitchen and the hearth and the chipped bowl had become ritual. On the second night, she had a fresh half loaf set aside on the table before he ducked through the door, and a clean bowl, and the smaller fire built up enough to warm the room without smoking. He looked at the bread, and at the bowl, and at her, and he sat without a word. He ate the way a man eats when he intends to be alive in the morning. She sat across from him this time, on the cook's stool, with her knees pressed together and her hands in her lap, and she watched the firelight find the scar along his jaw. On the third night, he asked her name. "Mara," she told him. He repeated it once, quietly, the way one might test the weight of a stone before lifting it. He did not give her his. She did not ask. On the 5th night, she noticed his hand was bandaged, and the bandage was bad, and she stood up and fetched the rag basket and the small clay jar of the salve she made from the herbs she gathered behind the stables, and she said, "Give it here." He did not. He looked at her hand, outstretched, and at the salve, and at her face, and something in his throat worked. And then he laid his wrist across her palm, as if he were laying down a sword. She unwrapped the bandage. The cut was deep and not clean, and had been bleeding off and on for at least a day. "Who did this?" she said, more to herself than to him. He did not answer. She cleaned it. She layered the salve. She wrapped it again with strips of linen torn from her oldest underdress, because there was nothing else. And if old Brunn noticed, he would beat her for it, and she did not care. Through all of this, he watched her, not her hands, but her face, with the still focus of an animal listening for something far away. When she tied the last knot and set his wrist down, he did not pull it back at once. He turned his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, very briefly, very lightly, as if testing whether she would break, and the hum in her chest, the thread she would not name yet, went so loud she thought he must hear it. He let her go. He stood. He paid her, as he paid her every night, with a small thing. The 3rd night it had been a sprig of dried heather. The 4th, a button of polished bone. The 5th, after the salve, he set down on the table a folded square of cloth, plain and gray, and when she opened it later in the loft above the stables, she found it was a fine wool shawl, thicker than anything she had ever owned, warmer than her blanket, and it smelled, faintly, of pine and snow, and him. On the 7th night, in the middle of his bowl, he set the spoon down and said, Who hurts you?" She froze. He had not raised his voice. He was looking at the bruise on her wrist, the new one, where old Brune had grabbed her that afternoon for spilling broth. "No one," she said. The lie was so old and so worn in her mouth, it came out by itself. He looked at her for a long time. He did not push. He did not threaten. He did not promise. He only looked at her, and the wolf behind his eyes looked at her too. And Mara understood, in the way one understands a storm front, that the man across her table had filed this fact away somewhere. It would not be forgotten, and would not be forgiven. He ate the rest of the soup. He left a token, a small iron key, the size of her smallest finger, with no lock to fit. "For the things you do not say," he told her at the door. Then he was gone, and the wind took the door, and she stood with the iron key in her palm and a heat behind her eyes that she refused to call tears. On the 9th night, he came in with blood on his sleeve that was not his own. She did not ask. She washed the sleeve in the kitchen basin while he ate, because that too had become a thing they did. On the 11th night, he stayed longer than usual. The fire burned low. She sat across from him with her chin propped on her hand, and she told him, without meaning to, about her mother, who had died of a cough 4 winters ago, and about the village at the edge of the hollow wood she had come from, and about the way her mother used to braid her hair before the lamps were lit. He listened without interrupting. He did not offer anything of himself in return. When she ran out of words, he said only, "Your mother would be proud." He said it as if he had personally weighed the question and arrived at a verdict. She had to look away. On the 13th night, he did not come. She kept the fire built up until the small hours. She sat at the table with the chipped bowl and the bread in the salve jar within reach, and she listened for footsteps on the back step. And there were none. The kitchen smelled of cooling soup. The hum in her chest was quiet and waiting. Toward the dim hours before dawn, she heard horses, many of them, on the high road. Not stopping, just passing. She closed her eyes. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a man like that, whoever he was, had 100 reasons not to come back to a backdoor kitchen and a serving girl with chapped hands. She told herself she had been a meal and a salve and a place to set down a wolf, and that this was already more than her life had given any other stranger. She put the soup back on the hook. She put the bread back in the cupboard. She went up the loft ladder with the small wooden wolf in her pocket and the iron key on a thong around her neck and the gray shawl around her shoulders, and she did not cry, because she had learned a long time ago that crying did not change what the morning would ask of her. He did not come the next night either, or the next. On the 3rd night of his absence, the inn filled up at sundown, which never happened, and old Brune came down the stairs in his good coat, which never happened, and 3 men in dark gray livery with a small silver wolf stitched at the collar took the corner table and ordered nothing. Mara in the kitchen kept her head down. The men in gray were not soldiers. They were quieter than soldiers. They were the kind of men who watched a room the way a cat watches a hole in the wall. Brune came back into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him. His face was the gray of curdled milk. "Girl," he said, and his voice was not his usual snarl, but something thinner, and that was worse. "The men out there are King's men. They are looking for someone. Do not speak unless you are spoken to. Do not look at them. If they ask about anyone who has been through this inn in the last fortnight, you tell them no one out of the ordinary. Do you understand me?" She nodded. She had no idea in that moment who they were looking for. She had several ideas at once. She did not let any of them rise to her face. Brune went back out. The men in gray did not stay long. They asked Brune 3 questions. He answered them all. The tallest of them rose, and his eyes swept the kitchen door once. And Mara, on the other side of it, held her breath and did not move, and counted her heartbeats, and did not look down at the wolf charm in her apron pocket. They left. Their horses went south at a hard trot. Brune came back into the kitchen, and his hands were shaking, and he did the thing he always did when he was shaken, which was to find someone smaller than himself to put it on. He found Mara. The slap caught the side of her face and snapped her head sideways into the edge of the table. She did not cry out. She put her hand to her cheek. She watched him through the hot ringing in her ear. "What was that for?" she said, very low. "For breathing," he said. "Get to work." He stamped up the stairs. Mara stood in the kitchen and tasted blood in her teeth. The hum in her chest, which had been quiet for 3 nights, rose up like an animal lifting its head, and she pressed her hand flat to her breastbone and told it, "Not yet, not yet." She did not know what "not yet" meant. She finished the kitchen. She banked the fire. She climbed to the loft. She did not sleep. In the small hours, the back door creaked. She came down the ladder so fast she nearly fell. He was in the kitchen. He was leaning on the table with one hand. The other arm was pressed against his side, and there was blood between his fingers, dark and slow, and his face was the color of old paper, and his eyes found her and held. "You should not be here," she said before she could think. "The king's men were here 3 nights running. They asked Brune." "I know," he said. His voice was a rope fraying. "That is why I did not come. I am sorry." He had never apologized for anything before. She crossed the kitchen. She lifted his arm. He let her. The wound under his ribs was a clean puncture from a thin blade, and it had been bleeding for hours. And she said a word her mother would have slapped her for, and she pushed him down onto the cook's stool and tore his shirt open at the side and worked. She worked the way her mother had worked in their own kitchen the winter the fever came, with her hands moving ahead of her thoughts, with the salve and the linen and the small iron needle she kept in the rafters for mending and now used for skin. He did not make a sound while she stitched. He watched her face. When she tied off the last knot and sat back on her heels, the fire had burned low and the sky outside the shutters had a thread of gray along its edge. And he was still alive. And so was she. And the kitchen smelled of blood and pine and the salve and the small green herbs she had ground that afternoon, without yet knowing why she had ground extra. She washed her hands in the basin. Her hands were steady. She did not know why her hands were steady when the rest of her felt like a struck bell. She turned. He was looking at the bruise on her cheek. He had not seen it before. The lamp had been behind her. Now it wasn't. His jaw worked. The skin around his eyes drew in. "Who?" he said. She did not answer. He stood. He should not have. The stitches pulled. She made a noise of protest and pushed him back down with both hands on his shoulders, and he let her, because he could not have held himself up against her in that moment if she had been a child. "Who?" he said again, very quietly. "Brune," she said, because she was tired, because she could feel the hum in her chest pressing under her hand, because the man across her kitchen had bled all over her floor for the privilege of asking, and she would not lie to him while he was bleeding. He closed his eyes. He breathed out long and slow, as if setting something down before he picked something else up. When he opened them again, the river ice was gone. There was a yellow ring around the iris that had not been there before. The wolf inside him had come up to look at her, and what it was looking at was the bruise on her cheek. "Listen to me," he said. His voice had changed. It was lower, the vowels rounder. There was a kingdom that had been pressed into it the way wax is pressed into a seal. Listen, Mara. There are people coming for me. They will find this inn within the week. When they come, you will not be here. Do you understand? I do not understand, she said. She did. She did not want to. He reached up. He cupped her face. His hand was cold from blood loss and hot from the wolf both at once. He turned her cheek into the lamplight and looked at the bruise as if he were marking it on a map. Then he said the thing that made the bottom of the kitchen drop out of the world. My name is Chaol. He waited. He let her hear it. She heard it. Chaol Varen, Lord of the Iron Pines, King of Vale by his father's death 3 weeks past. The man every Grey Rider between here and the capital was hunting. The man whose face was on the coin she had bitten yesterday to make sure it was not lead. The man who had eaten her soup. The man who had set a small wooden wolf on her table and said, "For the hands that fed me." She did not let go of his shoulders. The hum in her chest had become a roar. He watched her face, and she watched his, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "Eat your bread." She tore the half-loaf in half. She put the larger half in his hand. He laughed once, a broken, exhausted sound, and his head dropped forward and rested for 1 second against her collarbone, and she felt him breathe in as if she were the air he had been needing. He could not stay. They both knew it. Before the first cock crowed, Mara had packed everything she owned, which was not much, into a square of the gray shawl. She had taken the bread and the salve and the small iron key and the wooden wolf and the second best knife from the rack, the one Brune would not miss for a day. She had put on her cloak and her sturdy boots and braided her hair the way her mother used to braid it, tight enough to hurt. Chaol had laced his shirt closed over the stitched wound with the slow, careful breath of a man counting his own heartbeats. He had pulled his hood up. He had given her a look in the kitchen door that said, "You do not have to come with me." And she had given him a look back that said, "Do not insult me." They went out into the dark together. They did not take the road. They took the cart track behind the stables, and then the deer trail behind that, and then the bare hillside above the deer trail, where no footprints could be read in spring grass. Chaol walked carefully. She walked under his good arm. When the inn dropped out of sight behind them, she did not look back. She told herself she would not miss the kitchen. She told herself the truth, which was that she would not miss anything in it except the chipped bowl, which she had left on the table on purpose, set out the way it had been set out every night for him, with a cloth folded beside it, so that when Brune came down he would see it and not understand and be afraid. It was a small spite. She allowed herself one. They walked through the dawn and into the morning. By the time the sun was high, they were in the eaves of the hollow wood, and Chaol, whose color had been bad for an hour, sat down against the roots of a great pine and did not pretend he could get up again soon. Mara built a small fire in a stone hollow, because her mother had taught her how, and she set water to boil in the dented tin cup from her bundle, and she made him drink the bitter green tea she steeped from the herbs in her pouch, and she watched the river ice color come back into his eyes. He told her, while the tea steeped, what she had needed to know for 13 days and had not asked. He told her about his father's death, and the council's 3 factions, and the cousin who wanted the throne, and the advisor who, he was nearly sure, was the one truly pulling the cousin's strings. He told her about the ambush at the river ford that had cost him 6 men and given him the cut at his temple and the puncture under his ribs. He told her that he had stopped at her inn the first night because his horse had gone lame, and he had needed food and shelter and a place to set the satchel down, and that he had come back every night after that because... He stopped. She waited. He looked at the fire. Because of the hum, he said finally. Because of the threat. Because the second self in me put its head down on its paws the moment you handed me bread, and I have not been able to lift its head off its paws since. Do you understand what I am telling you? I think so, she said. She did. The hum in her chest had been telling her for 13 nights. She had not had a name for it. Now she did. He looked at her then, fully, in daylight for the first time, and the river ice and the yellow ring were both in his eyes, and he said, Mara, this is not how I would have done this. I would have come for you properly. I would have given you a choice that was not made on a hillside while I bled. I am asking you to believe that. I believe you, she said. The words were out before she weighed them. She did not take them back. She poured more tea. They went on at dusk. They walked for 3 days. He grew stronger. She grew quieter. On the second night, in a shepherd's bothy with no shepherd in it, he slept and she did not, and she sat with her back to the wall and watched his face by the banked fire, and learned the lines of it. On the third night, they reached a clearing where 2 men were waiting with 4 horses, and one of them, a wide-shouldered man with a black beard and a face that broke into open relief at the sight of Kale, dropped to one knee in the wet grass and said, "My king." And Mara understood, all over again, that the man whose stitches she had set was a crown. The other waiting man was thinner, younger, with quick dark eyes and a quicker mouth, and when he saw Mara at Kale's elbow, his eyebrows climbed and stayed climbed. "And who," he said, "is this?" "Mine," Kale said. The word was not loud. It went through her like a struck bell anyway. Then the thin man's eyes found the chipped wooden wolf at Mara's throat, where she had put it on the iron key thong for safekeeping, and his eyebrows climbed higher still. "Oh," he said. "Oh, that is interesting." The bearded man, who Mara would learn was called Torin, only smiled at her with a tired kindness and said, "Lady, you are with us now. We will not let anyone touch you." She did not know how to answer that. She nodded. They rode through the night. They reached the Iron Pine's hold by the second dawn. The hold was a stone keep set into a shoulder of mountain, smaller than she had imagined and older, with carvings around its lintels that her mother would have recognized and she did not. There was a household there that had been waiting on bad news for 3 weeks and was beside itself with relief at the sight of Kale alive. There was also a council. There was also a cousin called Wren, who arrived within the hour with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and a noblewoman called Sarah Voskane, daughter of the chief advisor, who arrived with him and whose smile did not reach any part of her at all. Mara, in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too large, with her hair still in her mother's tight braid and her hands smelling of salve, stood at the edge of the hall and watched Sarah Voskane look at her, and felt, for the first time since the kitchen, afraid. Sarah Voskane was beautiful in the way frost is beautiful. She wore deep gray and silver, the colors of the king's own livery, as if she had every right. She had been raised, Mara would learn within a week, on the understanding that she would be the next queen of Vale. She had been understanding this for 16 years. Her father, the advisor Lord Voskane, had personally drafted the treaty that named her so. The treaty was old. The treaty was, by the laws of the council, binding. There was a problem with the treaty. The problem was standing at the edge of the hall with her hair in a peasant braid, smelling of pine salve and rain. Sarah looked at Mara. Mara looked at the floor. Sarah smiled the frost smile and crossed the hall and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "Who is the girl?" Cale, on the dais, did not look at Sarah. He looked at Mara. "Mara," he said, "come here." She came. The hall was very long. Her boots made too much sound on the stones. When she reached the dais, he held out his hand. She took it. The hum in her chest sang once, loudly, and several of the older men in the hall lifted their heads at once, like dogs catching a far-off horn. Sarah Voskane saw their faces change. She saw Cale's hand close on Mara's. She saw the small wooden wolf at Mara's throat. Her own face did not change at all. That, Mara thought, was the most frightening thing about her. The hole did not know what to do with Mara, and so it pretended she was not there. The maids who were assigned to her room would not meet her eye. The kitchens, where she tried to help on the second day because she did not know how to sit still, set down their knives until she left. There were whispers in corridors that stopped when she turned a corner. She heard the word kitchen girl twice, and the word goat bride once, and a word she did not know in the old tongue that Torin, when she asked him at supper, would not translate. Torin was the captain of Cale's house guard and had become, without anyone announcing it, her shadow. He stood at her shoulder in halls. He walked her between the keep and the herb garden when she needed air. He did not speak much. When he did speak, he said useful things, like which corridor was draftiest in the evening, and which of the council lords had a wife who had recently lost a child, and which of the maids could be trusted to bring her water that had not been touched on its way. He did not say the word assassin. He did not have to. Sarah Voskane was everywhere. She was at every meal. She was in every council. She was in every doorway Mara needed to walk through, and she always smiled, and the smile was always a small, bright knife. On the third evening, Mara overheard her, by accident, in the gallery above the great hall. Sarah was speaking to her father, the advisor. Their voices carried on the stone. "He has lost his mind," Sarah was saying. "He has brought home a kitchen girl and put a wolf charm on her throat and expects the council to swallow it. He is concussed. He is grieving. He will come back to himself. Until then, father, you must hold the treaty." The advisor's voice was lower and slower and entirely calm. "The treaty will hold, daughter. The treaty has always held. The council does not unmake a treaty for a passing fancy. Be patient. Be visible. Be kind to the girl in front of others. If she is what you fear she is, kindness will cost you nothing and will be remembered. If she is not, kindness will look like grace, which suits a queen." "Yes, father," Sarah said. Her voice was a girl's voice for one moment. Then it was not. Mara stepped backward very slowly along the gallery. She found Torin at the foot of the stair. She did not tell him what she had heard. She did not yet know which pieces of it mattered. That night, Cale came to her door. He did not come in. He stood in the corridor in his shirt sleeves with his hand braced against the frame, because the stitches still pulled when he stood too long, and he looked at her with the river ice eyes that had begun, in the last 3 days, to thaw at the edges. "I cannot offer you the bond yet," he said. "There are rights. There are witnesses. There is a treaty I have to break in front of the entire council before any vow I make will hold by law. Until then, I will not touch you in a way that cannot be undone. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. She did not move. Neither did he. The corridor was cold. Somewhere down the hall a torch guttered. He let out a breath that sounded like a man setting down a stone he had been carrying for a long time, and he said, "Mara." Just her name. She crossed the threshold. She put her hand flat on his chest, over the linen, over the place where, if she had had the courage, She might have laid her ear and listened to him breathe. The hum in her chest met the hum in his, and there was a moment of double note. Two strings tuned to the same pitch, and his good arm came around her waist, and his forehead came down to rest against the top of her head, and they stood like that, fully clothed, in the cold corridor, breathing. He stepped back first. He did it carefully, the way he did everything now. "Sleep," he said. "Bar the door. I have a man at each end of this hall." She barred the door. She did not sleep. The next morning, he announced the breaking of the treaty in open council. He did it without ceremony and without softening it. "The Vosgane Treaty," he said, "is dissolved by ancient right. The crown will not bond by contract. The crown bonds by bond. There will be a claiming ceremony at the next full moon. All houses are invited to witness." The room went very quiet. Lord Vosgane did not move. His daughter at his elbow did not move. The cousin Wren at the other side of the table smiled the small smile of a man being handed exactly what he had been waiting to be handed. Mara, on the dais behind Kale, watched all three of them and understood, with a calm that surprised her, that something was now going to be tried. She had 3 days to find out what. She used them. She let Torin shadow her. She let the maids ignore her. She walked the kitchens, the gardens, the lower courts, the chapel, the small stone room at the foot of the South Tower, where the household washerwomen took their tea. She listened. Servants knew everything. Servants had always known everything. By the second day, she had learned that Sarah Vosgane had visited the South Tower still room twice in the last week without her father knowing, and that the still room held the household stores of bitter herbs, and that one of those herbs, a black-veined leaf called shadewort, was not for healing and not for cooking. By the second evening, she had learned that Wren the cousin had ridden out of the hold the previous night for 3 hours, alone, and had come back with mud on his boots that did not match the mud of any road in or out of the keep. By the third morning, she had found, in the dust behind a cupboard in the corridor outside her own door, a single small black-veined leaf. She did not show it to Torin. She did not show it to Kale. She wrapped it in a scrap of linen and put it in the pocket of her dress, next to the wooden wolf, and she went to find a child. There was, in the lower court, a small boy of perhaps 5 years called Pip, son of one of the washerwomen, who had attached himself to Mara on the first day she came down, with her sleeves rolled up. Pip was the only person in the keep who treated her like a person from the start. Pip was the reason she went outside at all. Pip had a habit of trailing whatever cat or chicken or stable dog had most recently noticed him. And Pip, that morning, was trailing a very small gray wolfhound puppy, the runt of the kennel master's most recent litter, the one no one expected to live, and which had therefore been allowed to wander. The puppy, Mara had noticed 3 days running, had taken to following Kale through the courtyard whenever he passed, and Kale, who did not smile in council and did not smile in hall, had been known to crouch down in mud in his good boots to scratch the puppy behind the ears. The kennel master had been visibly stunned. The puppy was called, by Pip and now by everyone, Crumb. Mara crouched down in the courtyard beside Pip and Crumb. She put her hand out. Crumb came to her hand. She rubbed the puppy's ears. She said to Pip, very seriously, "Pip, I need your help." Pip swelled with importance. Mara said, "You are not to eat anything in the kitchens for the next 2 days, unless it comes from a plate I have eaten from first. Do you understand?" Pip frowned. "Why?" he said. "Because I will tell you a story later if you do," she said. "About a wolf." Pip considered this. Pip nodded. Mara stood. She walked back into the hold. she did not go to Kale's chambers. She went to the chief steward, a tired man named Henrik, whom she had decided, on the basis of 3 brief conversations, that she could trust about as far as she could throw him, which was further than she could throw anyone else in the place. She said to Henrik, "Master Henrik, I would like to ask, as a favor, that you will not be required to remember if it goes wrong, whether the king's plate at table is tasted, and by whom, and how often." Henrik looked at her for a long second. Henrik said, "Lady, every plate is tasted by old Yvette, who has been tasting royal plates for 30 years and is loyal. Old Yvette has not died yet. I trust this." "I want," Mara said, "for the next 3 days, for old Yvette to taste from a separate portion, and for the king's portion to be served only from a dish I have personally seen filled, and for 1 extra spoonful of what is in the king's bowl to be set aside, unseen, in a small clean jar, and brought to me at the end of every meal." Henrik looked at her. Henrik said, "Lady, you have just described how to find a poisoner." Mara said nothing. Henrik said, "Lady, may I ask why you suspect a poisoner?" Mara said, "Because the council meets in 3 days, and a treaty has been broken, and a child in my kitchen at home once ate from the wrong pot and did not wake." Henrik said very quietly, "Lady, I will do as you ask." The hum in her chest was very loud in the corridor as she walked away. The claiming ceremony was set for the full moon, which was 4 nights off. The poisoner did not wait that long. On the 2nd evening after Mara spoke to Henrik, Kale's portion at supper, tasted blind by old Yvette in the kitchen and not at table, killed a kitchen mouser within 20 minutes. The cat, an aged ginger who had been allowed 3 licks for taste, died on the warm bricks by the oven with its paws stretched out, peaceful, as if asleep. Old Yvette, who had taken a fuller spoonful from a different bowl on Henrik's instruction, lived. Henrik brought the jar to Mara before the 2nd course was served. He brought it under his cloak, in his fist, the way one carries a heart. She took it. She looked at it in the light of her bedroom candle. She did not know what shadewort looked like in soup. She knew what black-veined leaves looked like in dust. She went to Kale that night, the jar in one hand and the linen-wrapped leaf in the other, and she did not bar the door behind her. He looked at her face and stood up at once. She said, "Eat nothing tomorrow that I do not eat first." He said, "What is in the jar?" She told him. She told him all of it. The leaf in the dust outside her door, the 2 visits to the still room, the cousin's mud, the mouser, Henrik, Pip, the puppy, Torin. She did not leave any piece out. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he sat down on the edge of his desk, because his stitches still pulled, and he closed his eyes for a moment. And the wolf behind them came up to the surface in a way she had only seen once before, in the kitchen, when he had asked who hurt her. "Sarah," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "Wren," he said. "Yes." "Los Cain himself," he said more slowly. "I do not know," she said. "He is calm. The men who run schemes well are calm. But I do not know yet whether he is steering his daughter or steering with his daughter." Kale opened his eyes. He looked at her with an expression she did not have a name for. "Mara," he said, "you have been here for 10 days." He had not meant it as praise. It came out as praise anyway. She lifted her chin. She said, "Eat nothing tomorrow that I do not eat first." He almost smiled. He did not quite. He stood up and crossed the room and lifted her hand and turned it palm up and pressed his mouth, once, against the inside of her wrist, where she had been bitten by hot oil 3 winters ago, and where the small white scar still showed. The hum in her chest answered the touch like a struck bell, and his eyes closed for 1 second longer than they needed to. Then he stepped back. "There are rights," he said. "Until those rights." "Yes," she said. They held the council the next morning, ostensibly to plan the ceremony. Chaol did not eat. Mara, seated at his left at his request, in a borrowed dress that fit better than the first one, ate a small portion of bread that she had cut from a loaf she had carried herself from the kitchen, and Chaol ate from her plate, with 2 fingers, the way a man steals from a sister's plate, with such ordinary intimacy that the entire long table fell silent for a half-second, and then resumed with the careful unconcern of people pretending not to have seen what they had just seen. Sarah Voskaine's hand on her goblet went very still. The cousin Wren, at the other end, laughed too loudly at something his neighbor had said. Lord Voskaine, halfway down on the right, did not blink. The council talked of guest lists and torchbearers and seating. They did not talk of poison. Chaol did not give them the opportunity. He had decided, Mara understood, that the cleanest way to draw a poisoner out into open ground was to behave as if there had never been any poison. Provoke. Wait. Let the second attempt come, because the second attempt would be hurried, and hurried attempts left fingerprints. She did not like this plan. She understood it. She did her part. She ate first from every plate that touched Chaol's. She slept with the door barred. She slept very little. Torrin slept less. On the 3rd night, the eve of the full moon, the second attempt came, and it was not poison. It was a girl. Mara was sitting up late in the small library at the end of the east corridor, because she could not sleep, and because the library was the only room in the keep where the books were old enough that the staff had stopped dusting them. And Sarah Voskaine was the last person Mara expected to find, pushing open the library door at the small hours of the night with a candle in her hand. Sarah looked at Mara across the candlelight. Sarah was not smiling. Sarah looked tired. Sarah looked, for the first time since Mara had met her, young. "Mara," Sarah said. The word in her mouth was not a knife. It was a word. "May I sit?" "You may," Mara said, although every instinct in her body and every hum in her chest said, "Do not let her near you." Sarah sat. Sarah set the candle between them. Sarah said, "I came to tell you that I am sorry." Mara did not answer. Sarah said, "I have spent 16 years being raised to be a queen of a country whose king I had never met. I do not love him. I never did. I was not raised to love him. I was raised to marry him. There is a difference. I am telling you this because I want you to know that what has been done in this house in the last week was not done by me." Mara watched her face. Sarah's face was a careful, composed thing. Sarah's hands on the table were not. Her right hand, where it rested by the candle, was trembling. The trembling was small. Mara would not have seen it if she had not been looking for it. "By whom?" Mara said quietly. Sarah looked down at her own hand. Sarah said, "My father. My father has been planning this for a very long time. I did not know about the shadewort until I saw it in the still room myself. And by then it had already been used once, and I did not have the courage to speak. I am telling you because I am trying to find that courage now. I came here to warn you. Tomorrow at the ceremony, in the moment before the rites, my father will rise and present a document, and the document will assert that the king is unfit to consent to a bond. He has witnesses. He has a sworn healer. He has signed statements from 3 council members. He will not call it a coup. He will call it a guardianship." Mara watched her face. Mara said very quietly, "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah lifted her eyes. Sarah said, "Because if I let him do this, I will be his puppet for the rest of my life. And I have already been a puppet for 16 years. And I find that I would rather be no one than that." Mara watched her hand tremble. Mara watched her face. Mara said gently, "Who taught you to lie this well?" Sarah went very still. Sarah said, "What?" Mara said, "Your hand trembles. Your hand has not trembled once in 10 days. It trembles now because you have been told to make it tremble, because trembling is what a frightened woman does, and a frightened woman is harder to refuse. Your hand trembles, Sarah, but your mouth does not. Real frightened women have shaking mouths." Sarah did not move. Mara stood up slowly. Mara said, "You came to find out what I know, and what I do not know, and to plant a story that places the entire blame on your father, so that when the council moves tomorrow, the king and his wolves will tear out the throat of the wrong man, and you will weep prettily and be saved and be queen anyway. I think you have been planning this since the day I walked into this hall. I think your father has done some of what you have just confessed, but I think you have done more. And I think the 2 of you have, between you, agreed only on which of you will be left standing when this is done." Sarah Voskane did not smile. Sarah Voskane did not deny. Sarah Voskane lifted the candle and stood. Sarah Voskane said, "You are cleverer than they said you were. That is unfortunate." She walked to the library door. At the door, she paused. She said over her shoulder, "Do not drink the wine tomorrow, from either cup." Then she was gone. Mara stood in the dark library with her heart hammering and the small wooden wolf at her throat hot against her skin. And she understood, with the cold, clean clarity of waking in deep water, that the real game had only now begun, and that the woman who had just walked out of the library was not the decoy. The woman who had just walked out of the library was the architect. Voskane was the front. Voskane was the visible villain, the decoy. The daughter who could not be touched by ancient law because she was the named bride and protected by the treaty until it was formally broken in front of witnesses, had built this. Mara went back to her room very fast. She woke Torin. She woke Kale. She told them both. They sat in Kale's chamber by the banked fire, the 3 of them, and they did not raise their voices, because the walls had ears, and the ears belonged to people whose loyalties were now openly in question. And they decided 3 things. They would proceed with the ceremony. They would proceed without wine. They would proceed with one further preparation, which was that Henrik, that night, would oversee the writing of a single document, witnessed by 3 lords whose honor Kale trusted, naming Torin as regent in the event of the king's incapacity. The document would not be shown unless needed. If Voskane intended to file a guardianship claim tomorrow, this document would gut it. Kale signed it with his left hand because his right was shaking from anger he had not quite let out yet. When the document was sealed and put away, he looked at Mara across the firelight, and the river ice in his eyes was entirely gone, and the wolf was sitting forward in him fully, and he said, very low, After tomorrow I will not let her near you again. Tomorrow I cannot promise." She nodded. She said, "After tomorrow." He said her name once, the way he had said it in the kitchen, when the word had been the only thing he could afford to spend. She let him say it. Then she went back to her own room, and she barred the door. And she did not sleep. The full moon came up over the iron pines like a coin laid on dark cloth, and the great hall of the hold filled with the houses of the kingdom in their best. And Mara stood in a high stone room above the gallery, with 3 women fastening her into a dress the color of river ice and combing out her hair the way her mother used to comb it out, tight and gleaming and braided through with a thin silver thread. She did not look in the long mirror. She did not need to. She put the small wooden wolf on its thong around her neck, over the silver. She put the iron key on the thong under it, against her skin. She slid the linen-wrapped black-veined leaf into the small inner pocket of the underdress, where it lay flat against her ribs over the hum. The hum was very loud tonight. She thought, as the women worked, of her mother. She thought of the soup pot. She thought of Crumb, the runt puppy, who had slept the last 3 nights at the foot of her door because Pip had told him to, and who that morning had refused his breakfast bowl in the courtyard and growled at it, low in his throat. And Mara had quietly taken the bowl and emptied it into the latrine pit, and given the puppy bread from her own hand instead. She thought of Pip, who had been moved that afternoon, on Torrhen's quiet instruction, into the gatehouse with his mother and the kennel master's wife and 2 armed men, because Mara had said, if anything goes wrong tonight, Sarah Voskane has had 3 days to plant a hand on a child in this house, and I will not give her a child. She walked down the long stair on Torrhen's arm. The hall opened in front of her, full of torchlight, full of faces, full of held breath. At the far end, on the dais, Cale stood in black and silver, and the river ice of his eyes was wolf yellow under the rim. The cousin Wren stood at the right of the dais, smiling. Lord Voskane stood at the left, calm. Sarah Voskane stood with her father in a gown the color of frost and silver, her hands folded in front of her, the very picture of a woman composed in adversity. The treaties named bride, the decoy, the architect. Mara walked the length of the hall. The hum in her chest carried her. She climbed the dais. She gave Cale her hand. He took it. The presiding priest, an old man with eyes like wet stones, began the rite. He named the houses. He named the witnesses. He named the ancient rite by which the crown bonded. He lifted the cup of bonding wine in both hands. Neither Cale nor Mara drank from it. Cale, in a clear voice, said, "By ancient right, I claim this woman as bonded to me, and I do not require wine to do it." The hall murmured. Lord Voskane stepped forward. Voskane lifted his document. Voskane began to speak about unfitness and guardianship and the council's solemn duty. Torrhen stepped forward at Cale's left. Torrhen lifted Henrik's document. Torrhen began to speak about regency and trust and the king's right to name his own succession. The hall, which had been holding its breath, exhaled into uproar. In the uproar, 3 things happened nearly at once. The first was that Sarah Voskane, who had been the picture of frost, lifted her right hand to her own brow as if dizzy, and several people in the hall who had been positioned to notice, noticed. The second was that Wren, the cousin, on Cale's right, took 1 step closer to the dais and slid his hand inside his sleeve. The third was that Crumb, who had been at the foot of the dais because Pip had told him to, and because no one had thought to remove a puppy, lifted his nose and began to growl. Crumb's growl was small. Crumb's growl was, in a hall this large, almost nothing. Mara heard it. Mara had spent 10 days listening for small things in this hall. She turned her head toward the puppy. She saw the puppy's nose pointed not at Voskane and not at Sarah, but at the cousin Wren. She saw, in the same instant, the small bright glitter of a blade clear Wren's sleeve. She saw the line of its angle. The angle was not toward Cale. The angle was toward her. Wren's plan, she understood in a single dilated heartbeat, was the cleanest version of the Voskane plan. Kill the bondmate at the moment of bonding. The bond half-formed and torn. The king destroyed by grief, declared unfit, the guardianship granted, the cousin installed as regent, the treaty restored. Sarah crowned, Voskane elevated, Wren rewarded. A clean line, a simple knife. There was no time to speak. There was time only to move. She moved. She did the thing she had done at every meal for 3 days. She put herself in front of Chaol. Not behind, in front. The knife came in low and fast. It went into her side, just above the hip, where there was no rib to stop it. It went into the hilt. The hall, which had been in uproar, fell silent in the breath between one heartbeat and the next, the way a forest falls silent when the predator is sighted. Chaol's hand closed on her shoulder. Chaol's other hand was suddenly on Wren's wrist. The wrist broke. The knife fell. The wolf in Chaol came up out of him so far that the men nearest the dais stepped back without meaning to. Wren went to the stones. Torin was on him before he stopped sliding. The hall began to scream. Mara did not feel pain. She felt heat. She felt the hum in her chest, which had been a hum for so long, lift its head and open its mouth and become something else. She felt her ribs go warm and then hot and then bright. She looked down at her own hand. Her own hand was glowing. Silver, threaded with gold. A soft, steady light that did not flicker. The light spread up her arm and across her chest and down into the wound at her side. And the wound, under the light, began to close. It did not close quickly. It closed with the slow, deliberate certainty of a thing that knew its own work. Around her, the silver-gold light kept going. It rolled outward across the dais and into the air of the hall like mist off a winter river. It found the cup of bonding wine on its little altar, and the wine in the cup went black, and then clear, and then steamed away to nothing. It found the small folded paper in Lord Voskane's sleeve, the one no one had yet known he had, and the paper crumbled to ash. It found Sarah Voskane where she stood with her hand still pressed to her brow in pretended faintness, and it touched her. And it did not hurt her, and it did not reveal her in any dramatic way to the hall. And Sarah Voskane, who had been a picture of frost for 16 years, looked at Mara across the dais and understood, in the way one understands a verdict, that she had been seen, fully, by something that did not care what she had been raised to be. Mara stood swaying on the dais. The light was costing her. She could feel it costing her. Chaol's arm was around her waist now, holding her up, and his other arm was outstretched, and a low, rough sound was coming out of him that was not a word, and was not a roar, and was both. He was holding her up. He was holding back the wolf. He was, with a control she had not known any living creature was capable of, refusing to let go of either of them. Mara turned in his arm. She looked at Sarah Voskane. She did not speak loudly. She did not need to. The hall was so silent that her voice carried as if she had stood on a chair. "Lady Sarah," she said, "you walked into my library last night and offered me a story you had built carefully for 3 weeks. I knew it for a story then. I know it for a story now. I will not ask the king to kill you. I will not ask the council to hang you. I will ask only this. You will leave this hall tonight. You will leave this hold tonight. You will not come back to it in your lifetime. If you do, the light that closed this wound in my side will find you wherever you are, because it is in me now, and it is awake, and it remembers. Take your father, take your cousin, take the road south." The hall was so silent the torches sounded loud. Lord Voskane went to one knee. He did not protest. He did not deny. He had felt the paper crumble in his sleeve, and he was an old enough courtier to know when the game had been called. Sarah Voskane looked at Mara for a long moment, and her face, which had been frost, was not frost anymore. It was a small, plain, frightened face, of a woman of about Mara's age, who had been raised by a clever father into a cleverer monster, and who had now been refused, in front of every house in the kingdom, the dignity of being executed for it. That, Mara understood, was the cruelest mercy she had ever given anyone. Sarah Voskane bowed her head. Sarah Voskane turned, and Sarah Voskane walked the length of the great hall on her own feet, past every house that had hoped to be aligned with her, and out into the dark. Her father followed. 2 of Torrhen's men followed them both. Ren was already in irons on the stones. The wolf in Chaol was still riding very close to his skin, and his hand on Mara's waist was steady, and the silver-gold light in her had begun, very slowly, to dim. She sagged. He caught her fully. He lifted her. He turned to the hall with her in his arms and looked at every house in it and said, in a voice that was both his and the wolf's, "This is my bonded, by ancient right, witnessed by you all. Let any house that wishes to dispute it speak now." No house spoke. The presiding priest, with his hands shaking and his eyes wet, said the closing words of the rite as if he had been waiting his whole life to say them, and had not known until this hour what they were for. Chaol carried Mara from the hall. Crumb followed at his heels. Torrhen walked behind them with his sword drawn. The household lined the corridors. No one spoke. In the small room behind the dais, Chaol laid her on the long bench by the fire, and he put his forehead against hers, and he said her name once, the way he had said it in the kitchen, and she answered him by lifting her hand and resting it on the back of his neck. The hum in her chest was quiet now, sated, dimmed to a low, warm thread. The wound in her side was a thin pink line. He kissed her temple. He kissed her cheek. He kissed her mouth, finally, properly, as if he had been saving it for the moment when no one in the world had any standing left to interrupt them. And she kissed him back with the patience of a woman who had been waiting 14 weeks for one specific door to open. There was an interruption all the same. There always was. Crumb the puppy, on the rug by the fire, sneezed loudly, twice, and Pip, who had run all the way from the gatehouse the moment the hall went silent, burst through the door with his hair on end and shouted, "Did she do magic?" And Chaol, who had not laughed since his father died, laughed against Mara's mouth. She felt the laugh more than heard it. She thought, "This is the sound I will measure all other sounds against from now on." She did not yet have a name for that thought either. She would learn it. Cousin Ren did not survive the night. His knife, when the council guard catalogued the weapons taken from him, was found to have been treated along its blade with shadewort, the same shadewort Sarah had stocked in the still room. The poison had been intended for Mara, to make sure the wound was fatal. The poison had been on the blade when Ren drew it. The poison had also been on the blade when, in his struggle on the stones, he had cut his own palm open on the broken edge of the hilt. He was found at dawn in his cell, cold, peaceful, his palm wrapped in his own torn sleeve. He had not even known he was dying. He had taken his own venom on his own hand and gone to sleep on it. There is a phrase the old people of Vale use for this, a phrase Mara would hear 3 times in the next year, and it does not translate cleanly. The closest English to it is, "The snake closes its own jaw." Sarah Voskane and her father were turned out at the south gate before dawn, on horseback, with cloaks and provisions and no guard and no escort. It was, by the standards of the Kingdom of Vale, a generous expulsion. Lord Voskane, who had expected to be hanged, took the cloak and the horse with the careful dignity of a man who knew he had been spared by a power he did not understand and did not intend to challenge. He bowed once at the gate, to no one in particular, and rode south, and was not seen again in the kingdom in his lifetime, although he was rumored, 2 winters later, to be living quietly under another name in a coastal town where he taught the children of merchants to read. Sarah was not so quiet. Sarah was, 3 months later, in the court of a small mountain kingdom 1 border away, and a year after that, attached as a confidential advisor to a prince of that court who was younger than her and far less clever. And Mara, when the report came in from one of Torin's letter friends, only nodded over her embroidery and said, "Of course. Some people cannot survive without a hand on a string. May she at least pick a kinder puppet next time." Torin laughed, briefly, the way he laughed now, which was not often, but more often than he used to. Within the Iron Pines hold, the change was quieter. The maids who had not met Mara's eye now did. The kitchens, where she still went sometimes when she could not sleep, set out a stool for her by the hearth and let her stir the pot if she wanted. And the cook, a stout woman called Errol, had taken, in the 3rd week, to scolding her about her wrists being too thin and pushing extra bread at her, which was the highest honor a cook of the Iron Pines could give anyone. The council, with its 3 most calculating members removed in a single night, settled. Replacements were named. 2 were old, careful men whose loyalty to Cale's father had been steady. 1 was a young woman from a border house Mara had specifically suggested, on the grounds that the council needed at least 1 person in it who had grown up in a kitchen. And Cale, who at first had laughed, had then thought about it for 2 days and then nodded. And the woman, a quick, clever creature named Hala, had taken her seat at the long table with the wary delight of someone who had spent her life listening at doors and was finally being asked to sit in the room. The hold settled. The kingdom settled. The mountains were what they had been. Crumb the runt puppy grew, slowly, into a leggy, ungraceful gray wolfhound with a feathered tail and an unshakable devotion to Pip, who lived now in a small set of rooms in the gatehouse with his mother, whom Mara had made head of the household linens, a job that paid 4 times what washerwomen made and was held in great respect because Mara had decided, on her first morning as bonded queen, that this was how it would be. Pip called her, when no one else was listening, Lady Mara. And when someone else was listening, my lady. And sometimes, in the kitchens, just Mara. And she let him do all 3, because she remembered, more clearly than anyone in the hold would ever know, what it was to be the kitchen girl. The bond between Cale and Mara settled too, in its own time. They did not rush the rest of it. He had said in a cold corridor that he would not touch her in a way that could not be undone until rights and witnesses had cleared the road. And after the ceremony, there was still the slow work of recovery, the long pink line at her side, the cost of the silver-gold light that left her tired for the better part of a month, the matter of letting a bond settle into a body that had not yet quite believed it was hers to keep. He brought her tea in the mornings. He sat with her in the evenings by the fire and read to her from books in the old tongue and translated as he went, so that she could learn it, and she learned it, because she had always been quick. He laid his hand at the small of her back when they walked into the hall together for meals, where the household, by long unspoken agreement, no longer fell silent when they came in. The first time she went to his rooms instead of her own, in the 8th week, she came of her own feet and her own decision, and he met her at his door and said, very low, "Are you sure?" And she said, in the same voice he had used the first night when he had said please, "Yes." He closed the door behind her. He did not hurry. He cupped her face in both hands, the way one might cup water one did not want to spill. He kissed her forehead. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed her mouth. He laid her down on the wide bed by the banked fire, and undid her hair from its braid one finger length at a time. He spoke her name into her shoulder, into the soft hollow under her jaw, into the small white scar on her wrist. The bond between them, which had been a hum for a year and a thread for half of one, woke fully under his hands and sang, and she felt, for the first time, the wolf inside him press his nose against the inside of her mind, gently, in greeting, the way an animal greets a thing it has loved for a very long time and has not been allowed to touch. He gave her every door. He let her open each one. She opened them. When he marked her, at the curve where shoulder met neck, where the old laws of Vale said a true bond was sealed, he asked her, with his mouth there, whether she wanted it, and she said yes, and he made the mark, and the silver gold light in her, which she had thought was sleeping now, woke for one bright humming moment and answered him with a mark of its own across his collarbone, a small, soft glowing line that faded into ordinary skin within an hour, but would, for the rest of his life, warm whenever she set her hand on it. Afterward, in the dark, he held her against his chest, with one large hand splayed open across her ribs, over the long pink line, and he said, into her hair, "You stepped in front of me." She said, into his collarbone, "I would do it again." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I am going to spend my life trying to keep you from having to." She said, "You cannot promise that." He said, "No, but I am going to spend it trying." They did not become parents at once. There was, first, a year of being newly bonded in a kingdom that had nearly lost its king, and had needed to see its king walk its halls. They walked them. They walked the high passes, too, on horseback in the spring, when the snow lifted off the iron pines, and the small streams ran loud, and the rangers' steadings opened their shutters. They walked the lowland villages in the summer. Mara, in plain travel clothes, sat in village kitchens and was given bowls of soup by women who did not know that the queen had once been them, and would not have believed it if they had been told. She listened to those women the way she had listened in the corridors of the keep, and 3 things changed in the kingdom of Vale within that year, because a queen had sat in a kitchen and listened. She did not take credit for any of them. Cale took credit for none of them either. Henrik, the chief steward, took credit for one, on Cale's quiet insistence, and walked taller for the rest of his life. The second year was harder. The cousin Wren had had allies they had not finished pulling up, and one of those allies put together a half-rebellion in a high valley in the late summer. And Cale rode out at the head of his houseguard, and Torin rode at his elbow, and Mara rode 3 days behind them with a column of healers and supplies, because she had refused, with the silver gold humming under her skin, to sit in the hold and wait. The half-rebellion was put down without much blood, because Cale had become, in his second year as king, a man who put down rebellions the way a good steward puts down a kitchen fire, fast and without theater. And Mara had become, in her second year as queen, a woman whose name traveled ahead of any column she rode in. And there were several minor lords who, on hearing she was 3 days behind their gates, decided very quickly that the gates would be opened to her people without further argument. They came home from that summer tired. They slept for 2 days. On the 3rd day, in the small garden Mara had taken over at the back of the keep, where she grew the herbs she had once gathered behind a stable, she sat on a stone bench with Cale's head in her lap, and his eyes closed, and his hand on her ankle. And she said to him, very quietly, "I think there is going to be one." He opened his eyes. He did not move otherwise. He said, very quietly back, "One what?" She said, "One of us." He sat up so fast, he nearly knocked over the cup at his elbow. He looked at her. He looked at her face. He looked at her stomach, which was not yet showing anything to look at. and back at her face. He said her name. She nodded. He laid his forehead against hers. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, into her hair, "What do we call her?" She laughed against his shoulder. She said, "We have not even met her yet." He said, "I have met her every day for 2 years in your face. We are going to call her something." They called her, when she came, on a clear winter morning with the moon still up in the daytime sky, Lyra. Lyra of Vale. 6.5 pounds of yelling, with a faint silvering of fine hair already on her head, and her father's river-ice eyes that would, the midwife said, almost certainly change color by her first birthday. And her mother's stubborn small jaw, and a grip on Cale's finger that made him laugh out loud the first time he felt it. The way he had laughed against Mara's mouth in the small room behind the dais on the night of the ceremony. The way he laughed now. The way he had not laughed at all in 12 winters before a kitchen girl had handed him bread. Crumb the wolfhound, who had grown to a vast, leggy creature with a feathered tail going gray at the tip, lay across the doorway of the birthing chamber for the entire labor and would not be moved. And when Lyra cried for the first time, he lifted his head and made a sound that was not a bark and was not a whine, but was somewhere in between. And Pip, now nearly 11, and the tallest he had ever been, who had been waiting in the corridor with his mother, came in and looked at the small wrapped bundle in Mara's arms and said, "Oh," like a person who had just been handed a small piece of the sky. And Mara, exhausted and bright, looked over the top of her daughter's head at Pip and said, "Pip, this is Lyra, who is going to follow you around the courtyard for the rest of her childhood, whether you like it or not." Pip swelled with importance, the way he had swelled with importance once before, in a different courtyard, in a different life. And he said, very seriously, "My lady, I will let her." The household lined the corridors again that night. They had grown used to lining corridors for these two. They did not speak. The maids who had once not met Mara's eye stood with their hands folded over their aprons and watched her go past with a baby in her arms and a king at her shoulder and a wolfhound at his heels. And Errol the cook, in the back of the crowd, was weeping unashamedly into her sleeve. Henrik the steward bowed to the baby. Torn, the captain of the house guard, who had not bowed to anyone in his life except Cale, bowed to the baby too. Hala, the young council member, who had been kitchen girl once and was now a lord, bowed deepest of all. The hold settled into night around them. Cale laid Lyra in the small carved cradle by the fire in their chambers, the cradle he had had made out of a single piece of pine from the high passes, with small wolves running carved around its hood. And he did not, even though it was nearly midnight and they had been up for 2 days, want to go to bed. He stood at the cradle for a long time, looking down. Mara lay propped on pillows in the wide bed by the fire and looked at the back of his neck and at the way his hand rested on the rim of the cradle, as if he had set a hand on something fragile and was now afraid to take it away again. She said very softly, "Come here." He came. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took her hand. He kissed the inside of her wrist, where the small white oil scar still showed, where he had kissed her the first time he had kissed her at all. He said, "The night you fed me." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you remember what I gave you?" She smiled. She reached, slowly, painfully, to the bedside table, where on a small square of folded gray wool, the same square of wool he had given her the 5th night in the kitchen, the same shawl she had carried out of the inn over her bundle, lay the small wooden wolf with the chipped ear. She had taken it off the silver thong months ago, when she had begun to worry the chipped ear would break further with the constant turning. It lived now on the table by the bed, where she touched it every night before she slept, and every morning when she woke. She lifted it. She held it out. He took it. He looked at it in the firelight. He said, "I carved this when I was 12. I carved 100 of them the year my mother died. I gave them all away over the years to people who fed me on the road. You're the only one of them who kept it." She said, "The chipped ear." He said, "I dropped that one off the wall of the hold when I was 13, because I was angry at my father." He laughed once, quietly. He said, "Of all of them." She said, "It found me." He said, "You fed me." He laid the small wooden wolf on the rim of the cradle, where it would, by morning, be the first thing Lyra saw. He climbed into the bed beside Mara. He laid his hand very gently across her belly, where Lyra had been until that morning, as if checking the empty room for echoes. And then he laid it, more gently still, on her hip, over the long pink line that had become, over 2 years, a thin silver line, and over that line, very softly, the silver gold light hummed once in recognition, and went quiet again, content. He said, into her hair, "What would have happened if you hadn't given me the bread?" She said, into his collarbone, "You would have eaten somewhere else." He laughed quietly. He said, "No, I would not have. I would have gone north and been killed in a different inn by a different knife, and the kingdom would have gone to Ren. The kingdom that exists because you handed me a piece of bread." She said, "That is a very large thing to put on a piece of bread." He said, "It was a very good piece of bread." They slept. Crumb lay across the foot of the bed. The fire burned low. The small wooden wolf with the chipped ear watched over the cradle. Outside, the moon went down over the iron pines, and the kingdom of Vale, which had nearly lost its king 2.5 years before to a knife in a great hall, slept under the keeping of a queen who had once scrubbed a back step in the mud for coppers, and who had, on a wet night, in a kitchen that smelled of onions and old smoke, looked at a stranger too large for her doorway, and pulled out a stool and pointed at it, and decided, without knowing she was deciding anything at all, to feed him from her own plate. There were a few moments in this one that stayed with me. The chipped bowl on the table the morning after, set out as if he might still come. The way Crumb the puppy growled at the bowl in the courtyard, and a Queen of Vale emptied it into a latrine pit without a word. The mercy of letting Sarah Voskane walk the length of the great hall on her own feet. I'd love to know which one landed for you. See you in the next story.